And welcome to another fun-filled episode of that 401k podcast. I'm here with Dan Venturi. Dan, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Can't complain. Just really busy. You know, we got all these events plotting. I got My Fair Lady tickets tonight. I got to go to the city. So a lot of things are happening. You know, we got a lot of events. Atlanta's going to be in a few weeks. We're going to have to scratch Bob Horner. He's not going to be able to make it. We'll have another guest shortly. That's April the 12th in Atlanta. We got a game that night as well. May 3rd, Kansas City, Missouri. We got a game May 2nd against the Rays, but May 3rd is our event in Kauffman Stadium. Denver, June 14th. That's also Friday night. And we got a game that night against the Padres. Whether we include that ticket as part of the attendance, that we might be going that way, we'll see. Then we got New England we announced for October 11th at Foxboro Gillette Stadium. Working on the event details for Dallas in December. MetLife Stadium probably in November, and Cleveland's hopefully in September, and working on maybe a national conference next year, March 2020. Be on the lookout for it. So we're busy. We're working on a lot of things. So and we got this podcast. For the 25 people who listen to this. Actually, there were more last week, so it's growing. Like fungus, like cancer, whatever. Our listening public is growing week by week. So anyway, this week we're going to talk about plan enrollment education meetings, why plan sponsors have to have them, why I think it's one of the most neglected parts of a 401k plan. Dan, what do you say about those? You've been through some enrollment meetings.
Sure.
Education
yeah,
meetings?
no, and I think we touched on some of them previously, but it's most certainly an antiquated model. I mean, I think we've been banging our heads against the same wall in the same way for 30, 40 years. I don't think the enrollment meeting has changed. I don't think the enrollment kit's changed. I mean, maybe we added one of those quizzes, right, to do a little bit more CYA, but we mentioned it when we were in Tampa. I'm just starting to see now some different thoughts on enrollment meetings and participant meetings and the best way to target them. We've got our own thoughts on some stuff and are going to be introducing a more centralized way to handle the enrollment experience. Without the, let's call it the antiquated approach. But to I guess your original point, Ari, it's an incredibly important part of the participant experience, right? How often do folks go back to a 401k plan outside of that initial, enrollment meeting, or, the next time the advisor comes around and do some education a year or so later? I mean, that's really the few times that folks are even thinking about this stuff.
Exactly. First off, I did a blog piece. I don't know if you saw Captain Marvel when it's in theaters now, and I watch anything Marvel related. And what was funny about that movie was the story was set in the 90s, when before the Marvel Cinematic Universe came into play, and it was kind of funny. She falls out of the sky into a blockbuster video, and a lot of these allusions. Music is from the 90s in the movie, and there's scenes dealing with the internet and how slow it was, and internet cafes, and the joke about my blog was, if you sent Captain Marvel, if you had Captain Marvel in the 90s, and she went to a 401k enrollment meeting, aside from maybe how the PowerPoint looks, and aside from, you could go to a website and direct your trades, I don't think there's much difference from the late 90s from now. Like 20 years ago. The enrollment meetings are the same. The only difference I see is, yeah, the PowerPoint looks a little bit nicer. The computers are obviously faster, so the presentations look nicer. And then you have a website where you can actually direct investments that you couldn't back in the day. So that's the only differences that I see. And so it's changed in those areas, and then it's stagnated for most of it. And it's kind of funny that it has, because when we look at the workforce today, the kids in their 20s today that are starting out in the workforce, and those are the future of the business, the millennials, they were toddlers or youngsters 20 years ago. And what they do today, meaning they're not using paper anymore, everything's electronic and web-based and on the phones. It's just funny that the business, at least the predominant part of the retirement plan industry, hasn't changed and moved with the times in terms of the technological aspects of educating participants and bringing them in the onboarding process, which is, it's a bad thing because they're not changing with the times. And in my career, I always was the guy who butted heads against people who always said, well, you know what, it's always been this way, so this is the way it should be. It started in law school where, you're taught, this is the way law school's been taught since the 1860s or 1870s, 1880s, whenever they came out with the Socratic method. That's great, but, you got to get the thinking out and change the approach in terms of the model of educating law students or getting them prepared to be lawyers. And there's always been talk about that, how law school doesn't really prepare people to be lawyers, and how that changes. But, you're told, from an age at law school, well, this is the way it always is, and this is the way it should always be. And I did the same thing, working for law firms and working for TPAs. I'm always the guy who questions, maybe not authority, but questions whether there's a better way to do things. And I think there's a better way to have education enrollment meetings, and the industry and plan sponsors have not changed with the times. So let's first discuss as to why we actually have them. Plan sponsors treat these enrollment meetings like they would treat, an annual physical, which, on Monday will be the first physical I've had in about 3 years, or a meeting at a visit to the dentist, and treat these enrollment meetings as something that's just, check the box and just do it because we have to. And let's discuss, Dan, as to, why we actually have to bother with them.
Sure. Well, I think depending upon, the situation, an initial enrollment meeting might be a much smaller audience than, say, an ongoing education meeting. So I think maybe we should even consider breaking up the two, right? Ongoing education meetings, I think the huge component, and we've touched upon this in previous podcasts, is, the requirement that third part of 404C, providing reasonable education on the investment selections that are offered to participants. That's a great opportunity to do that, right? And one that clearly every defined contribution plan sponsor has an obligation to meet if they want that safe harbor. So I think that's the big reason, right? Secondary to that, obviously, folks aren't familiar with the plan. They might not be the savviest investors. They might be looking for that push to sort of get off the sidelines, get off the fence, and get in the plan. Maybe be a little bit more risky. Things along those lines. I think the thing too that sort of gets lost, and we've talked about this. I don't know if it was on a podcast or it was just off to the side, but there was that hokey ING commercial from a bunch of years ago where folks are toting around a number with them, right? And that's a number that they need to retire. And I think that's should be, if it's not already, the focal point of these meetings, right? Get people comfortable with that number. Get them thinking about that number. They got to keep score.
Yeah, first things first, the reason that we actually have these meetings, again, it goes back to me bashing Pat, who was the HR director of my old law firm.
You can't help yourself.
Oh, I got to milk it for all it's worth, because
every
Because I was reading, because the firm is kind of dying. It's down like maybe a third since I left. Like 9 years. I can't. I got to hammer things to the ground. And I don't know what she's not the HR director anymore. She's kind of running the office and whatever. Give her a fancier title. And when I was there, and she told me to look at the plan, and at the time there were no enrollment meetings, there were no education. It was the old, here's the Morningstar profiles of these funds that this ERISA partner picked 10 years ago, and good luck to you. That's not really how it goes in the ERISA 404C. We have these participant-directed plans, and you got to put plan participants in enough information for them to make informed investment decisions. And that, again, the enrollment education, I kind of all slop it together because, we have the initial enrollment period, the new enrollees, and then, an education component as well for the existing enrollees. And, it's all about limiting the plan sponsor's liability. And if you're not having these enrollment education meetings, you're not doing a really good job in limiting your liability as a plan sponsor, because you're doing nothing, as Pat was doing before I set her straight, and of course hired the advisor that I didn't recommend, the one advisor that I didn't recommend. But I have to always talk about that. But again, enrollment meeting, education meeting, that goes hand in hand with having an investment policy statement, hiring an advisor, all these kind of good fiduciary practices. And obviously the problem with ERISA 404C is it's very vague. There's no requirement that you have an investment policy statement. There's no requirement that you have plan education meetings. But you have to offer them something. And at the very least, offer them plan education. We'll talk about investment advice, and we'll talk about that probably at the end, and why that could be an important facet. But it's all about, getting participants ready, getting them informed, because obviously better informed participants have better investment returns, and participants who have better investment returns are less likely to sue than those who have poor investment returns. And they need to go through with it. It's an important part of a fiduciary process, and it's really it's not part of a nutritious breakfast, but it's a fundamental component in the fiduciary process in order to limit their liability on the ERISA 404C. It's it's something they have to do. They don't want to do it. It's mundane. It's boring, whatever. But it's got to be done. And one facet that I always find is I don't think plan sponsors, when it comes to these enrollment meetings, actually keep many good records about these meetings.
I couldn't agree with you more on that one. I mean, you see like these sign-up sheets, and you wonder what happens to them after you leave. I mean, I've done my fair share of enrollment meetings as a consultant, and inevitably, and this isn't a knock against HR people, but, there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of, organization, and I truly do wonder, borderline worry about what happens to those records. I dare say that they, the likelihood that they're around a few years later are pretty low.
If they keep the records, I mean, I've never, I've seen a lot of plan sponsors. They have meetings and they never bother to take records. Oh
no, agreed. I'm just saying the ones that do, what happens to them? If they're I guess with it enough to even consider keeping records, what happens to them?
Yeah, it's important that a plan sponsor, keep everything records. It's not enough they just keep records of fiduciary meetings and all that kind of stuff that goes on in those meetings. They should also keep records of the plan education enrollment meetings. That means, the attendance sheet. They should hand out an attendance list, as well as, in my opinion, the marketing or the advertising of those meetings. Show that this wasn't decided to have it at 2:00 in the morning when there was only going to be one person present. Show that there was actually a step by the plan sponsors to actually have these meetings, inform participants about it, and then actually have them. So that's why it's, I think, really good fiduciary practice to keep these records. And, good record keeping is a great way to show that the 401k plan sponsor is following the processes, under ERISA 404C. And
would you go as far as saying the employer should make the meetings mandatory?
Listen, I don't know about mandatory. I would try to make it as mandatory as possible, or try to bribe them, or just do it at a period of time where you're going to get maximum attendance. But should they make it mandatory? Probably, but you're still going to get a couple people that don't show up.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it's you don't want to be flippant about these meetings because it's all about reducing your liability. So whatever you can do to strong arm people to attend, I don't know if you have to bribe them or force them, but I think that's a great way to have them attend. Whatever you got to do, give them free lunch, give them free pizza. I mean, free pizza goes a long way. That's what I always said back in college. Free pizza.
Does. People will show up for just about anything.
Yeah,
look at the timeshare industry. People show up for that just for a free vacation.
Yeah, I know. I always get offered that. You have those sign-ups at the City Field, free vacation. And my wife always signs up for it. I'm like, if they're going to call you, they're going to badger you. And I'm like, I don't want to be sold something. And, it's a whole to-do. And I remember years ago when I was a kid in Orlando, we were on vacation at Disney World. And my parents, it was like, I think they were giving us tickets to medieval times. And so, for 4 tickets, they had to sit through 2 hours of presentations on timeshares in Orlando, and I got to play in the arcade or whatever it was. You got to do what you got to do, but it is what it is. But you have to do something to get people to attend these meetings because it's a good practice. And like I said, free pizza. I had that idea in college to get people to. I was a college Republican to get them voting, so I had this idea, and we ordered this pizza, and I think we had 2 people who showed up, and I got a lot of free pizza out of it. But and of course it was Domino's, which
Why are you telling that story? That's a bad story.
Well, because I'm honest, and a lot of times it works, and sometimes it doesn't. The other times it worked, around that time they had a barbecue to celebrate diversity in protest, in a silent protest as this anti-Semitic speaker, and they got a lot of people for that one. So free food does work, but that's just one suggestion. And one thing I believe is stop making the enrollment meetings sound like a funeral or look like a funeral. And I think that's more on the providers. They're still running the meetings like, I don't know, it's like those damn steak dinners where some insurance guy invites you to dinner and tries to sell you annuities. It's like they're new tricks. Speak to people on their level. That's what I always said. Speak to people on their level. Make them understand. And, stop, thinking this is the Wall Street Journal meets Barron's slash plant education enrollment meetings. Get people involved. Get people interested. And all that kind of stuff. That's really what's important. And again, it goes back to the whole millennial thing. What you could tell baby boomers is different from what you can tell millennials, and getting them involved, and interests of baby boomers, interests of, I guess, we're Generation X. I don't even know what we are anymore.
We're Generation X.
We're getting so damn old. Or whatever, millennials. You have different audiences. There's different approaches. And let's get away from, the approach that everybody's a baby boomer. Let's get to the approach that the baby boomers are aging out. They're retiring. Let's get to some techniques and approaches that are going to work well with Gen X and millennials. And it goes back to the presentation that Power had at Tropicana Fields at that 401k conference. Talk about Snapchat and this and that. What are the approaches that a plan sponsor can take and make to make enrollment and education meetings more relevant, more interesting? And again, that's also a role for plan providers. Stop with the paper enrollment forms. Let's do things on the iPad. Let's, maybe even, bring in, you could have, more presentations utilizing Google Chromebook or an iPad or whatever it is. Something really interesting. Use a web, presentation as part of it. I mean, really dumb, stupid stuff that's simple and gimmicky, but will get people interested. Like, have an education meeting about basic terms, and then do maybe like a challenge where you have a trivia contest. I always talk about how I always hated holiday parties. I don't know. I always felt that the holiday parties, because I never really got a holiday bonus. I always thought the holiday parties was a throwaway by the bosses to, make them look good. And, I always thought the cheesiest part were when you work for businesses and they only invited you to the holiday party. God forbid they should invite your spouse or significant other.
Yeah.
That law firm was one of those cheesy ones. So my wife could never go to these things. But, I had one where they did invite my wife, certain TPA, and, a lot of times, the holiday party was done by the boss to give a boost to their own egos. But there was one time where, they brought in some entertainment, magic tricks or a trivia contest. So imagine doing an enrollment meeting where you have a trivia contest. Talk about plain education concepts, and then do a quiz afterwards. And whoever wins gets a $25 gift card, or something that's engaging, thought-provoking, and bringing people involved and interested in there, instead of everybody falling asleep like it's when I took driver's ed.
But no, some of those driver's ed videos were good.
Oh, they were, I just
that's
remember
right up your alley. That's reality '70s disaster TV.
But I didn't have that. I had those, remember those strips where they show it on the. That's before VHS. Remember that?
I do remember those films.
They have those strips with the audio. You got to play the audio. You got to make sure it lines up with the film strip.
I do remember that.
Yeah, the projector. Oh my god, this.
Man, that's early '80s right there.
But anyway, the driver's ed, it was just, how many classes can I miss and still qualify to get the blue card? That's really, if I miss 3, can I still get the blue card and get a senior license at 17? That's all really that mattered. But, there's got to be something more to get people involved. It's like Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Everybody's sleeping in class, and, it's like Mr. Hand's class. Who's on dope and who's sleeping, and who's, or in Ferris Bueller when, people are drooling on the table because they fell asleep. You got to keep them engaged and keep them interested. And if you do that, you go a long way to getting them involved and doing a better job of bringing them in. But
yeah, be more like this podcast. Be laid back and loose. Have some fun.
Yeah, chill out.
Exactly.
Whatever. Bring in Wade Boggs for an enrollment meeting. I think,
That'd be awesome. You can talk about funds for 5 minutes, and they'll talk to you about hitting for the rest of the hour.
No, it reminds me. I think I told you that story where there was a CBS. I forget, it was like a Bill Geist report many years ago where the California DMV, the kind of the drivers ed meetings, like when you what you call it, the safe drive. What do you call that? Defensive driving course.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you get a ticket, to get points off, you have these defensive driving courses. But originally the California State used to do it, and then they deregulated it, and so there were these companies that were offering defensive driving, but like with different like gimmicks. Like there'd be a defensive driving class for San Francisco 49ers fans or people who like chocolate. Or, so it's like, yeah, why don't you have enrollment meetings that, maybe suit to an interest or something that, that you could talk about. I mean, that's why that 401k conference was my kind of idea where, you bring in sports, have it at a venue, bring it together, make it interesting, and let it stand out outside of every other boring 401k conference. And that's how I feel about education enrollment meetings. Do something different that's going to be out of the box, going to keep people interested and get them involved. Because if you get people involved, better participation, less liability, all that kind of jazz. And of course, last but not least, let's throw out there investment advice. Plan education is all about broad education concepts. Investment education is specific investment advice geared towards participants on their lot in life, their role, their where they are on the glide path towards retirement. And there are a lot of plan providers that offer that, and then there are plan providers who don't, and so you could get a third party to do that. But it's something that it's something that I think every plan sponsor should consider offering, especially if it's very low cost.
Yeah, services typically are in the 50 basis point range.
Depending on some models, you could do $10 a head and certain $10 to $15 a head per certain different platforms.
And then what are you getting for that $10-15? Is it
online investment advice
specific to your 401k plan?
Yes, by a third party.
Got it.
And whether it's whether you're using these companies or you have a TPA you're working with or advisor that offers this kind of service, I just think that that's something that really should be considered, because advice is obviously more specified and could help plan participants out, especially those who have really no knowledge about investment decisions. What do you say?
What do I say? I'm curious. I've seen them. I was actually just a little taken back by the cost that you threw out there. I'd seen them higher up market. I hadn't seen them that low. I think it's a tremendous value to plan participants.
Well, that's just for online. That's online only. That's not at a meeting. But there are other providers that offer it. So it's something. There are different kinds of levels of investment advice services.
Mm. No, and super valuable. I've found that the single biggest problem with most plan sponsors is just fear factor, intimidation. I think once they actually get past that, they can do pretty decently on their own. But unfortunately, the vast majority of people can't get past that. And if you're not willing to sort of get past that initial barrier, then by all means, advice is a great thing to take advantage of. Another thing I would think, we should probably caution plan sponsors on, another thing to keep an eye on, right? You want to evaluate that and make sure that your participants are getting value, for their money, and you're going to want to document that you have a review process. But, outside of that, I definitely think it's something that, enhances the plan overall, or the perception of the plan overall, and doesn't really cost you, the plan sponsor, anything additionally.
Right. Exactly. So, that's really it for, I think, this week.
That's a nutshell?
Yeah, I think that's a nutshell. Again, it's really an important part of the plan process that most plan sponsors really ignore, and it's not something I don't think I could afford to ignore. So I think that's it. So until next week.
Before we end, there was because I want to make sure we give folks the historical fun fact. There was an opportunity earlier when you were talking about giving folks pizza to show up in enrollment meetings, and I think they're two great flashbacks to history that we can sort of mention. The first one was, and you probably know this one, that giant hunk of cheese that it was President Jackson, I believe, that had it. The president that's getting removed from the 20, Andrew Jackson, for Harriet Tubman, had a giant. I don't know who gave it to him, but it was some diplomatic thing, I believe, and he ended up with this giant wheel of cheese. And he put it out in the hall of the White House and invited the general public to come eat the cheese. And, boatload of people showed up and ate his cheese. So, that's a little historical fun fact. And then the other one was the history, I want to say barbecue. Washington, early political rallies involved food. And, again, the concept was, I'm going to feed you and you're going to vote for me. So, in both instances, people tend to react on their stomach. So have these when you have these meetings, have some pizza, have some bagels, have some barbecued chicken.
Yeah, donuts aren't expensive either. Whatever it is, it's just I don't know. It's a free food goes a long way with me. I don't know. It's just And speaking about pizza, I will tell the story in concluding this event. One of my favorite stories of all time. Worked for a TPA. It was CBiz Retirement Services Inc. I'll say it because they no longer exist. But one of my favorite stories is there were word that it was 2002 and the business was going badly, with the market and all that. And we're given a list of like there are going to be about 7 or 8 people who are going to be fired that day. They're going to be let go because we got to cut back. And there were a lot of funny parts about that day. I was, obviously I wasn't even working for the TP. I was working for the affiliate law firm, so I was safe, whatever it was. And so I'm talking to somebody, and I kind of have like a list of who they should fire. Who's not very good. And, if you're going to lay off people, lay off these really bad employees. Not one person that I named get clipped. And the person that I was talking to, he's the one who got clipped, even though he was in charge of one of our biggest clients. And the best part of it was the next day, it was a Valentine's Day massacre because it was on Valentine's Day. The next day it was a Friday, and they brought us pizza. and there were so many people who refused to eat that day, and I had, for whoever didn't eat the pizza, I ate double because as far as I'm concerned, they didn't bake the pizza with anybody's blood. And it was delicious pizza. It was from Syosset. It was I think Mario's Pizza or something like that on Jericho Turnpike. And it reminded me something out of Glengarry Glen Ross. Remember? You first the winner of the contest, you get a Cadillac. Second place, set of steak knives. Third, you're fired. And it just reminds me, like, if you didn't get the pizza, you got fired. And the very funniest part of that story was, I think a couple weeks later, I go to my boss, my immediate boss, Harvey Berman, and we're talking about something. I'm like, whose dumb idea was to have that pizza party, like, the day after people got clipped? And he said, it was my idea. I'm like, okay.
And that was the end of the meeting.
Yeah, that was the end of the meeting. That's why and then people wonder why I went on my own. Because I had these opinions and should have kept them to myself. But, that's my favorite pizza story.
Well, that's a good pizza story.
It had nothing to do with our thing on enrollment meetings, but you had me talk about pizza and all that stuff.
There you
and
go.
Cheese and whatever. So anyway, until next week, it's Dan Venturi and I saying so long.
Have a great weekend.